Hi, thank you all for being here. If you have missed my introduction, so I'm Roy. Um, I work and live in Amsterdam, and I'm going to tell you something about testing GraphQL. So, before I'm actually going to tell about what testing in GraphQL could look like, I'm going to ask the question, who's this talk actually for? Because a lot of people I know, they actually don't test their code. So, they either test the code in production or they test it just by clicking some buttons and then pushing their features to production. So, I'm not saying you should test your code with code. You can also have manual testing, or there are services to help you with testing. But you should always think about how to test your code. So, like I told you, I'm Roy. I live and work in Amsterdam, and most of my time I spent on working for the city of Amsterdam, where we develop open source products. And we also develop some GraphQL servers built on top of internal APIs. And I also work with some other companies. And you can find me on Twitter with the handle @GetHackTeam. So if you've got some questions after the talks that you couldn't ask in the live chat, then make sure to find me on Twitter. So why write tests? So there are multiple reasons to write tests, and it isn't only to be safe about to be sure about your code, but there are also actual reasons to test your code. So one of the things I really like is check if code behaves as expected. And this is something you can do in a lot of ways because it's really simple to test simple code. So if you have a function that sums up two numbers, it's really easy to test that code behaves as expected. But if you have a function that um, calls other functions, maybe it is a composed function, or maybe it's even an entire UI, you want to make sure if the code underneath this test is behaving as expected. And something else I really like to do is check if errors and edge cases are handled correctly, because a lot of time I write like error messages in my code, or I have edge cases that I don't really document. So if you don't document them, probably the next developer working on the project, or maybe even yourself, if you look at the code after a year, maybe you don't even know what the code is about anymore. So one of the things I really like writing tests for is for errors and edge cases, because edge cases should really be documented. And there are more reasons to test your code, right? So other reasons are making refactoring easy, and especially if you're not using something like TypeScript, just like plain JavaScript, or maybe even like Python. If you start refactoring your code and you don't have any tests in place, it's really hard to make sure that the outcome will be the same. So I talked about the edge cases just before. If you have edge cases in your code that aren't defined somewhere, like in documentation or in tests, and someone start refactoring, then there's a really big chance those edge cases will get lost. So the next developer will probably write new code, refactors everything, and then maybe that one moment when someone pushes a button from a certain location, your edge case will be gone. And yeah, so it also improves your code quality, in my opinion. So if you're working with code reviews with team members, then probably your codes get better after every review. If you're writing tests for your code and it's really hard to write a test for your code, then probably your code is hard to read. So if you don't have someone to review your code, you should definitely review your own code by writing tests and see how easy it is to write a test for the outcome of your code. And the same as I told about the edge cases, tests can also be documentation for your code. So improves your code quality, right? Because who likes debugging? And about the documentation, it can really serve as documentation because if you look at this function, so this is from a design library I've been working on. So you're going to import some functions and then you're going to test these functions. And then you can actually write down what your test cases are. So maybe your test case is to check if it returns undefined, maybe it should throw, maybe there are other test cases you want to be in there. And especially if you're familiar with test driven development. And something like this is really helpful because test driven development is going to help you document your code before you even write the code, which is actually a really great approach. And this is something you can have for GraphQL as well, both server side and client side. But we have a look at that. So what can we actually test when we're testing GraphQL? So we can test schemas, right? Especially if you're working with schema first designs, or maybe you're programmatically creating your schemas, then you should definitely test those schemas. So you want to know if your field is actually a string or a number before it goes to the GraphQL query. So you don't want to test your schemas on runtime because it's going to throw errors. You actually want to test your schemas maybe in compile time, or maybe even just when you're running your test and you're pushing your code to production. So these are ways to test your schemas before actually having users use the schema. And you can also test resolvers, right? Because if you're familiar with resolvers, and you probably are, unless you've only been using GraphQL client side, but you can test resolvers. Resolvers are just functions. They're either async or they're synchronous. They probably have promises in there, and they're probably going to make a connection with a database, external services, maybe internal services. And these are things you can test. So you can test if your resolvers are collecting the right data for your responses as defined in your schema. So you should really have a separate look at testing schemas and resolvers because they're doing different things, but in the end they can come together and they can be the same. They can share the same tests. And are there more things you can test on server side? There probably are, right? Because maybe you can also test performance of your GraphQL server side, and maybe do performance testing, see how many concurrent users you can have, what will go wrong if you're sending the same query like 8 different times, or maybe sending the same query with 8 different arguments. So these are all things you can do with performance testing. Or, like I told you, you can test it client side. And this might be really interesting to test it client side because in that scenario, you're not actually testing GraphQL or how GraphQL works. You're more testing if the libraries or packages you're using for GraphQL are working as expected. So, but how to test GraphQL? So, I want to test schemas, resolvers, and maybe you want to test how schemas and resolvers work together, right? So how to actually test this? There are multiple ways. So one of those things you should have in there is static type checking. With static type checking, maybe with TypeScript, or maybe just by utilizing the schema itself, you can make sure that there won't be any incorrect fields in your schema. And also unit tests, like the resolvers I told you about, they are functions, so they could be really easy to test with unit tests. And maybe your resolvers will have helper functions or utilities. Those probably are really good to have unit tests. And the integration test is for situation where you want to combine your schema and your resolvers and see if they really have the correct outcome as you expect. So maybe you're going to have an integration test that's actually checking your schema to your resolver and then maybe even sending a query or mutation with it. And then where you can test the entire flow or parts of the flow, which is very similar to end-to-end tests, right? Because you can imagine there might be an end-to-end test where you're testing something client-side. So you're requesting a query client-side. This query is going to be sent to your server, and your server should be handled with the schema and the resolvers. So that way, you're probably testing the entire chain for GraphQL, both client and server side. So that could be an end-to-end test. So the strategy for testing, and probably if you're really into testing or you've read a lot about testing yet, there are different strategies to test your application. No matter if it's a server or a client, there are different ways to test applications. So one popular approach is the pyramid approach. That is probably the oldest one, just as pyramids. It's a pretty old approach for testing software in general. And there is also uh, the reverse pyramid. So both are actually patterns you could use for testing. And let me tell you about the first one, the first pyramid first. So this is like the traditional pyramid of testing. And as you could see, it's a pyramid. So at the bottom there's a lot, and at the top there's less. So usually you would have type checking like right down the middle, right below the middle. Because type checking is important, it's really easy to do a lot of type checking, and it runs pretty fast. And next to type checking, you also have unit test in there. So unit test and type checking, according to the traditional pyramid of testing, they should really form the basis, like the fundament of your testing pyramid. And then in the middle, there will be integration tests. Because integration tests, they're a bit harder to write because you're actually going to connect multiple services or pieces of code. And that's why they also run slower. You're not testing a single function or a single object. You're testing multiple functions, how they work together, maybe even doing some front end and back end at the same time. So integration test, you can test like it's more mission critical. It takes longer to run. It also takes more time to write. They're definitely helpful. And at the top, you can find end-to-end tests. And those are really testing your entire chain. So you can imagine these tests are harder to write. They run really slow. So that's the pyramid of testing, right? So you have a pyramid, unit test, integration test in the middle, and at the top, you would have end-to-end testing. And then you could have a reverse pyramid. And this is actually, if you talk with business managers, they probably really like the reverse pyramid because reverse pyramid there's a lot of end-to-end testing. So if you're asking non-technical people and they want you to test your code, they probably say, "Yeah, we want to test if someone clicks on my checkout button, if they will actually buy the product." But that's something. It's really hard to really test this real good because someone clicks a product in your client, it's going to send requests to servers, it should resolve, it should give information back. So if you're really technical, you probably feel this is an anti-pattern. If you're a business manager, you probably really love having a lot of end-to-end testing in there. And then quite recently, or maybe like a few years ago, a new pattern erupted for testing. So out with this anti-pattern, and a new pattern came in, which is actually it's a Champions League of testing. So this actually is a Champions League trophy, I guess. And actually, the idea about this, at your very core, it is static type checking. So static type checking should be at the base. You would have some unit tests above, and you have a lot of integration tests because integration tests they are important. Integration tests actually test multiple pieces of code together, and end-to-end tests they're at the top. There are a lot, there are some less end-to-end tests, but there's still quite a lot. That basically what this pyramid is, what this trophy is saying every type of function should have their own sort of testing. So you can't test all your code because the coverage of 100%, it's really hard to get there. And also integration tests, they're more important because you can test if one function works, you can test if the other function works. It doesn't really mean that both functions will work together. So there are different types of testing, and for GraphQL, I actually like this approach. So you can split it around. There are multiple use cases. Resolvers have their own kind of testing. You should definitely test resolvers and schemas together. Maybe you shouldn't test whenever you're sent a query if your resolver is being called right, because your schema can probably handle it. So let's start by looking at testing schemas. And testing schemas, you can do them a lot of different ways. Something I really like with testing schemas is you can actually check if your product type, which I've defined on the left, actually matches the product type as you want it to be. So I'm not sure if this test actually says something because you're just testing if of your abstract syntax tree from GraphQL on the left side is equal to the right side. So this is a test you could make. I'm not sure if you actually get real advantage out of this test. So for bigger schemas, there are other ways to test it. And one of the packages I really like for this is Easy GraphQL. And Easy GraphQL is actually made by someone who works for Cypress, so he's really into testing. And it's really easy to install as well because it's just an npm package. And you can use it for mocking, for test assertions, so you can test if your schema actually fits certain criteria, if are allowed to make certain queries. And it looks something like this. So at the very base, you're going to start with importing your schema. Because without a schema, you can't test the schema, right? So basically, you're going to feed your schema to Easy GraphQL Tester, and you'll be able to test assertions to it. But for sending assertions, of course, you should mock it because you have to make assertions with some kind of data in mind. So you can see it on here. So I'm testing a schema. You can see it's a query, and I'm going to send a variable in it as well. And at this part with tester.mock, I'm actually going to send my query. I'm going to send my variables, and I'm going to say I want to mock stuff. So now I'm actually testing if the reviews field of my product, if it will be an array. And you can even extend this test by seeing if it will be an array with a certain length, with certain fields in there. So these are things you can quite easily test with this one just by using this package. And it's going to save you a lot of time writing assertions with maybe Enzyme or Jest or whatever you're using on your side. I'm just going to see if your mock actually returns data. And of course, instead of mock data, you can actually use your real data or maybe even create mock data if you want. Or assertions directly. This is actually something I really like because if you look at this one, it saves you a lot of time. If you look at the previous one, so actually what we're saying here right here, we have a query, you've defined the abstract syntax tree, and you're just going to have easy GraphQL tester see if your product ID will return a certain field for something. So now we're actually testing whether my query works. And you can find all information about this package on this website. You can also just go to npm or GitHub and find the project there. So for schema testing, it's really nice to have easy GraphQL because it saves you tons of times. So resolvers are actually they're a bit different to test, right? Because there are a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff at stakes for testing resolvers because maybe you have a database or existing services beneath it. So resolvers they are a bit more tricky to test, but there's one important thing you should keep in mind. Resolvers should be pure functions. You don't want side effects in resolvers. You want every effect for your schema to have its own resolver, and then you probably want to merge them together later on. So you don't want resolvers to be something else than pure functions. And if they aren't pure functions, it's going to be really hard to test them. But it will be even more important to actually test them because if you don't test functions with side effects, you're probably gonna regret it later on. So pure functions and your resolvers actually they should be a black box, right? So you would have this black box, something goes in, maybe it's beer, it's some friends. Everything goes in the black box. And what you want to know is the outcome of the black box, right? But no matter what happens inside the black box, so your pure function, you're pretty sure it will always be fun. So there will be a lot of fun coming out of your resolvers if you put some friends and beer in there. At least that's what I suppose. But so pure function should be the same way as this black box. So you send something in, and you're pretty sure whatever you send in, it will return something based on what you send in an expected format. And that's what your resolvers should do, right? Because resolvers they get the information for your schema from your database, for your services, or maybe from computing it somewhere else. So for testing resolvers, it's quite easy to just write assertions. So you're gonna send in. So I have a function or maybe a resolver, invite friends, probably linked to mutation. You're gonna send some variables in there. So 6 friends, some alcohol. It should be a success, right? So whenever you send this mutation, you're probably going to be pretty sure that you're going to invite friends, 6 in total, with some alcohol. The outcome should be success party, and maybe it should mutate some field. So these are all you should do with your resolvers. So in practice, this means something else, right? Because this is all pure theoretically, but you should also write code to do this for you. So you would have a resolver. It could be something like this. So maybe you're getting reviews for certain products. We just saw someone talking about an e-commerce store. This could actually be a resolver for that e-commerce store if it was written in JavaScript, right? So you're going to send the parent object in there, which is probably product or maybe it's reviews, some arguments, and the context. And it's going to return probably the reviews. So it's a pure function. There are no side effects. We aren't calling anything in between. And then to test this pure function, you can, if you're using JavaScript like I usually do or TypeScript, you can just use jest for it. So we're going to test if this resolver will return the reviews. So we have an object. It probably should fit this object. We're going to see if it equals, and it does. So this is all you need to do if you're testing resolvers. So maybe you have some normalizations in there. You probably should test those normalizations as well. And then we get to a bit more tricky part, right? Because we already saw schema testing, which can be done with Easy GraphQL tester. We saw resolver testing, which should be done with Jest or whatever is your programming language you're using. An integration test, actually, you're going to bring these two together. So you want to test your schemas with your resolvers with your schemas. You want to test if queries work, mutations work, if they generate the right information, if they mutate, whatever you want them to mutate. So these is stuff you do in integration tests. And like I told you, integration tests, they will be a bit harder to write than unit testing. And you can actually see the schema testing we did as sort of a unit test for your schema. So we're actually going to bring back multiple unit tests together, right? We have a unit test for schemas, a unit test for resolvers, and now we're going to write an integration test that's going to see how they work together. And for this, you need to mock your server because you need to get some information from somewhere. And yeah, so mocking is probably the easiest because if you aren't mocking at this point, you're probably testing against your real server with your real client, which you shouldn't actually want to do. And integration tests, they're also a bit funny to me because you can test if two functions work together, but it doesn't mean the entire house is built correctly. So maybe you're just testing, oh, I built a new house. Let's see. Oh, I've got working electrics and I got a front door. Doesn't mean you have a house. So integration tests, they aren't like the Holy Grail, but it's a step towards getting to that Holy Grail. So Apollo has some cool functions to do this, to have server mocking and have integration tests. So assume we're using Apollo server, you're just going to set the mocks variable to true. So this is the, if you're going to instantiate the new Apollo server, you have some fields, some options you could put in there, and you're just going to say mocks is true. So now Apollo server will mock whatever you're using with your schema resolvers. And you can actually try this together with Postman. So I'm using Postman for mostly when I work with REST APIs. I want to get the return of the REST API. But now Postman also have an option to send GraphQL. So you can use GraphQL queries in Postman from the interface. And basically, it means you should have a pretty new version of Postman installed. But it means you can send GraphQL queries just from Postman. So instead of using GraphQL Playground, you can just stick with the tools you already have, like Postman. And I've created a test for this with some code here as well. It's probably easier if I send you a link afterwards as well. So you can actually see the code, see what I did there, and see how I'm testing my server GraphQL. So schemas and resolvers, that kind of stuff. So on the client side, there's other stuff you can test as well. Because we've so far we just covered servers, and servers are usually easier to test than clients because the only thing that happens, you have schemas, resolvers, you're sending some stuff on and on. If you're testing client side, we also have to test the tools we're using. So my preferred tool for the front end is React. So which means if I'm testing client side, I should also test React. So I should test if I can send refs, how to handle local state, all that kind of stuff. It will be in your test as well. So client side testing is a bit more complicated. But it probably looks something like this. So what I've done over here, I've used Apollo query component, and I'm sending a query to get some product information. Well, the query component returns me some variables like loading, error data, and I'm going to map those. And this is like a pretty simple front-end application, right? I'm just going to get some data with a query, and I'm going to display it in my application. And something we actually want to test is this component, right? We want to see if our query component returns the query. Henceforth, you want to test the query component actually renders all the other stuff that we put in there, like how to display the products. That should actually render the title in this scenario. So for this, there are things you can use, and something you can use is the mock provider from React Apollo. And also, you should need some sort of testing library for React. So in this scenario, I went for test renderer from React. You can also use React testing library or Enzyme to do this for you. So the first thing you need to do, we actually need to mock the GraphQL client. You don't want to work with the real GraphQL client because then you're probably going to test Apollo's products. Well, actually, they should test their own product, right? So we want to test the code that's in there. So we're going to mock a provider so we don't have to deal with actually live data or maybe any other data that shouldn't be in our mocks. And a test pretty much look like this. So you should mock your data, mock the response of the query component, like we did on the right side. And on the left side, you can see we have a mock provider. We're sending mock data. We're going to render our products component, and we're going to see if our products component is rendering the correct products. So actually, we're going to look for a H3 element, and we're going to find it in our component, and then we're going to expect this H3 element to be displaying the title test. And if this all works, it works. And we can also use snapshots for this, but I'm not really a fan of snapshots. So I would probably prefer to go just by seeing is the title set correctly? Do I have the correct amount of products rendered? These are all things you can easily test client side. And for this, I also created some code. And again, I will post this code later on so you can display it on your own. I will also post it on my Twitter after this. So this is a really pretty basic forward example of testing client-side React with GraphQL. And for end-to-end testing, there is more stuff you can do because end-to-end testing, like we told you, you're going to test the entire chain of GraphQL and your client application and your server together. So for this, we're going to use almost the same tools, except for this time, we're going to be using the actual Apollo provider instead of mocking it. So before we used the mock one, which means we're not really testing a server. This one, we're going to go for Apollo provider, so we're actually going to test our server, which is a bit more exciting, right? Because now a server comes in place. Before we just mocked everything. Now a server might send us some actual responses. And I believe the example for this is also in this code sandbox as well. So if you would open this link, you would go to a code sandbox and you can actually find how to do this. So we covered end-to-end testing. And for dessert, something that I haven't told you just yet is you can also use performance. You can also use load testing to see what your performance of your GraphQL server will be. So in the beginning, I already told you that you could do some other tests server side like performance testing. And for this, there's a package called Easy GraphQL Load Tester, which is pretty great. Let me see if we can get this up right there. So basically, it's just going to take you some config, and it's the same package as we saw before, but then a different version. So Easy GraphQL is the package that I showed you before to test your schema. You can also use it for load testing. Basically, is this one. And if you are already familiar with load testing, you can see you can already use tools that you use for other load tests as well. Because let me see where it is. You can use it with artillery, which might ring a bell if you've used load testing before. And I believe there's also some other tool you can use it with. Oh no, for now it's basically using artillery IO. So in here you can have some config in there. You can set a duration, like how much you want to test. You can set an arrival rate. You can set some headers, and it's all based on a single JSON file. So you're going to send queries with it, with arguments, get more information out there. You're going to test against local servers. You're going to have selected queries, headers, and this is actually the very basics getting started with load testing for GraphQL servers. And if you aren't familiar with this, definitely check it out. Um, because one of the reasons GraphQL servers should be tested really well is because you could get performance issues. If you look at the GitHub API, they actually expose two APIs. One is with REST, one is with GraphQL, and the response limits for the GitHub REST API are way higher than for the GraphQL API. So you can send like 10 times or 100 times more requests on the REST server than you can do on the GraphQL server. And that's because with all those nested relationships, it can get quite tricky to code all the data that you requested. So that's why you definitely should check out load testing. So to summarize what I've told, and sorry, I usually speak very quickly, so it's a lot of information. So to summarize, I talked about testing GraphQL, and we're going to use should use static type checking for it. So type checking really is important when working with GraphQL because your schema have types. So probably if your code doesn't have types, you're going to run into problems sometime. We also have unit tests because resolvers, they're pure functions. We can just use unit tests to test our resolvers. And the same goes for the schema. You can also use unit tests for your schemas using the package I showed you. And integration tests, they're one of the most important things to do. So you want to test how your schema works with your resolvers, how your schema works with your client, if your client is actually going to send requests, how to handle those requests. These are things you will do in integration tests. And end-to-end tests, yeah, we saw we can just use them, right? So we can mock our provider when you're using client side. We can also choose to have our actual provider in there and test against our live server, maybe or test server, or set up all other sort of testing principles with both client side and server side at the very same time. And load testing, which was sort of the small dessert I gave you at the end. But definitely check out that package because you might be really amazed by how your GraphQL server performs when using it and sending like 5 or 6 queries at the same time. But maybe you're really shocked. So definitely have a look and see how it actually performs before sending the GraphQL server into production. And the very last thing I want to give with you is 100% test coverage doesn't mean you don't have any bugs. Like bugs will always be there in any code, no matter if the code is 20-year old or 1 year old. There will always be some bugs, and testing is a way to reduce the amount of bugs to make your code more stable, to improve your code experience. Um, it shouldn't be a game to get to 100% test coverage because if you're writing one feature and you can test 80% of it, probably that's enough. If you can't test that last 20%, and those last 20% is the most important part of your code, then you did something wrong. Because you should also test the important part of your code, but you don't want to test components when you're probably pretty sure it will render or it won't render. So pick your battles and don't try to get to 100% test coverage because bugs will always be there. Tests should just be there to streamline you and to reduce the amount of bugs. So for this, maybe we can take this one offline. So which do you actually prefer? Do you still prefer the old-fashioned pyramid of testing, or are you actually going to go with something a bit more modern, where there's like an almost even spread with integration tests, unit tests, and end-to-end tests? Because it takes a lot of time to write end-to-end tests, but they can be really helpful, right? So let's take this conversation maybe to the chat and see which one do you prefer. And so yeah, if you want to learn more, definitely find me on YouTube. Just search for my name, and you will find tons of videos about me talking about React or GraphQL. Or just find me on Twitter or Instagram, which you can find me with the username GetHackTeam. Or have a look at these other two websites to find out more about GraphQL and testing GraphQL, both client side and server side. So let's head over to the chat and see if there are any questions from you.